Well, Tosca never learned responsibility, and that shapes everything that she does in the opera. So we know from the first act of the play, when Cavaradossi describes Tosca to Angelotti, that Tosca is an orphan. And that's really, really important because that means she didn't have a traditional upbringing. And that means that it explains her fear of abandonment, and that explains her jealousy. So she's looking for a parental figure in Cavaradossi or Scarpia. And she was found in the mountains as a shepherd by these nuns who took her into the convent and raised her. And Cavaradossi tells us that she barely learned to read or pray, but she got musical instruction. And so by the time she was 16, she had a bit of a notoriety. And the composer Cimarosa actually petitioned for her to become an opera singer. And it was because of the Pope's blessing that Tosca was able to go to Rome. So she shows up to Rome not as some refined, highly educated, well-adjusted woman, but rather like an instinct-driven survivor, someone who has a difficult childhood, shaped by abandonment, and someone who has a great talent. Well, Tosca's glamour was not built on long training and some kind of discipline or integrity like we think of today. This was a very different time in Rome in 1800. Theaters were closing and opening, and audiences were ruthless. They were rowdy. Working conditions were dangerous. Being a singer or an actress at this time was likened to being a prostitute. It wasn't a respectable job. And it was very unstable. You couldn't have a domestic life. You lived a different life. It was unconventional. And women actually were just allowed to return to the stage at this time after the castrati ban. So a lot of the training was very, very short, and you were just thrust on the stage, and you learned by doing it. So the idea of polish and mastery, this was not the currency of the time. The currency was really appeal, personality. It's more like the Kardashians than it is what we think of today as a modern diva being some representation of high morals and artistic refinement. So, and this was right for Tosca's personality, because let's not forget, she's a survivor. She's instinctive, volatile, and she's searching for approval. So she's celebrity driven. So Tosca is not the kind of modern diva that we think of, but rather she was more a phenomenon. So Scarpia is enforcing the system, not inventing his own system. You have to understand, we're in Rome in 1800, and at this time, Italy's not even a country yet. It's a bunch of pockets of different powers, ruling powers. And in Rome, it's a papal state. So that means the Pope is deciding, like, he's responsible for the church and state enforcing this society as it is. It's very controlled. It's not a society of justice. It's controlled, and it's controlled through fear and punishment, just like the Spanish Inquisition. So having a revolution or protesting or like saying anything against the church or state is considered treason. And this is like the worst crime you can commit. So The law at the time, all the courts and all the enforcers of the law in Rome, it was like a complete disaster. There was no consistency whatsoever. So this was a breeding ground for corruption. And that included also police officials. So everyone was lying, cheating, bribing, manipulating, including Mario, Tosca, and Gelati. Everyone is able to somehow manipulate and negotiate their way through this society. And fear is really the governing tool. So forms of punishment like interrogations, torture, public humiliation, and even executions were regular tools of the enforcing powers. So Cavaradossi, we have to understand, Cavaradossi being arrested for harboring a fugitive, and Scarpia knows he's a political radical as well. This is totally on board with the society at the time, and the interrogation that Scarpia puts him through to try and get a confession, try to get information. This was also not an exceptional act of cruelty. This was the society at the time. There are other Scarpias doing the same thing at this time. And these were legally sanctioned methods. So we're living in a society where everyone is morally compromised. Well, first we need to suspend our own personal sympathies, because being sympathetic means that we're being subjective. And in order to understand any opera, one has to be objective and impartial. So on that note, I just want to say, as an actor, our job is to advocate for the character that we're playing. That means understanding the complexity of the psychology of that character. Understanding does not have any kind of connection to our own personal beliefs or opinions as private people. But as artists, it is our job to advocate, period. So what do we know about Scarpia? Scarpia is a nobleman, and he is the chief of the papal police. And they are called the sbirri, and they are known for corruption, bribery, exploitation, extortion, etc. We know this is a society that is running on fear and punishment and control. So it is the system that is cruel. It's institutional cruelty, not personal cruelty. And all of those police and enforcers who have to carry out all of this violence, all of the orders to enforce the law and all of the protocols, are put in a position where they have to suppress their empathy in order to carry out these commands. This is psychologically sound. So this is not personal sadism on Scarpia's part, but it's rather an institutional dissociation. And if we ignore this context, then we are also psychologically flattening Scarpia's character and reducing him to a sexual predator. We are actually projecting our own discomfort with the nuance and complexity of the character and the situation. And we stop thinking when we aren't comfortable with such themes. And it also holds Tosca to a different standard because it reduces her agency and her accountability when we reduce this to villain and victim. So power and desire does not necessarily mean sexual assault. These are not mutually exclusive. Scarpia he has to answer to a higher power, the church and state. And when persons are under this kind of pressure from authority, it is psychologically explainable that they offload some kind of fantasy for control or domination in other parts of their life as compensation. And so we're entering, with Tosca and Scarpia, we're entering the realm of erotic domination. And this does not mean physical violence. There is another, there are other nuanced ways of looking at that topic. And I think that we as a modern society are uncomfortable looking at this topic without equating it immediately to violence or sexual assault or some kind of violation. So power and desire plus our own discomfort with the topic allows us or results in us removing erotic ambiguity and reducing our conclusions to sexual assault. And let's not forget, Scarpia, he confesses his desire and love for Tosca. He tells her, "You're not like any other woman." And what he means is that she carries the same capacity for intensity as he does. And so love and hate are two sides of the same coin. And what he really wants from her is not to force her into some sexual act, but he wants her to willingly yield to him. And he needs her to do that by her own assent. If we allow Tosca to have agency, then she also must have responsibility. And let's not forget, in the score, Scarpia is never violent. There are no stage directions for that. There's nothing that he says that claims that he'll be violent. In fact, he even says, "I'm not going to be violent, you're free to go." So Tosca is not powerless in this equation. She has something Scarpia wants, which is her willing participation. And she tries everything: bribery, deceit, manipulations, begging, religious appeal, and eventually she resorts to violence. So she's equally manipulative in this dynamic as Scarpia, and she's untrustworthy. She does not keep her promise, neither does Scarpia. So they're both playing this dangerous game of manipulation between each other. And after running out of options, she gives in to his deal, which is a lifetime, so Mario's life, for a moment, or a moment with him. And she agrees to this because, just like Mario and Angelotti, they believe that they can negotiate with karma, with God, with the law, with reality. They believe that they can get themselves out of the consequences of their decisions and escape accountability. And this is exactly what Scarpia exploits in Tosca, is this belief. Where is the aria in the second act where the heroine, the supposed heroine, prays to God or begs Scarpia to take her life instead of Mario. Just spare Mario, just take mine, just don't take his. That is not at all her mindset. Her mindset is geared right at herself in everything that she does. She's not self-sacrificing. Her visitate is a complaint. Hey, I did everything I was supposed to do. Why am I being rewarded in this way? So if we give Tosca psychological depth and strategical intelligence, we have to also hold her responsible for the consequences of the decisions that she makes, even under intense pressure. Tosca does not kill Scarpia in self-defense. Self-defense requires anticipated or imminent violence. And Scarpia himself doesn't anticipate violence coming from Tosca. He doesn't restrain her, he doesn't disarm her, he doesn't keep a distance, he doesn't guard his body. And let's not forget, this is a police chief. He's trained in exactly these situations. He should be able to detect that there's a physical threat, and he doesn't. He's off guard. And actually in Rome in 1800s, knife stabbings on the street were like a daily occurrence. There were numerous knife stabbings at this time. So this is something in particular he would be highly aware of, and also he would know how to deal with. So the fact that he's not expecting any kind of resistance from Tosca is decisive. His lack of vigilance is decisive in this moment. He believes that the conflict between the two of them is not physical, but a psychological battle between the two of them. And he believes at this moment it's been resolved. So her murder of him is disproportionate. It's a catastrophic overreaction to her collapse of illusion. Because Scarpia forces Tosca into accountability. After she's tried every other way to get out of the situation, she's left with a reckoning. And she can't tolerate that. This is not victim and brute. That's a very lazy reading of the score. Tosca, we give depth while we deny Scarpia that kind of depth and understanding. And that reduces the reading of the story to moral labeling: good, bad, right, wrong, justified, not justified. So the tragedy here begins precisely where understanding and justification diverge. This is not a romance destroyed by evil. It's a fantasy destroyed by truth. So they're youthful, they're immature, they're hopeful, they have fantasies. That is true. And there is an infatuation there, a very, very strong one, in fact, which is based on sexual attraction, it's based on fantasy, it's based on jealousy, secrecy. And this is not a mature, healthy relationship that is mutually responsible or supportive. And you can see that in the way that Mario describes Tosca to Angelotti. He says, she's a jealous woman. I can't tell her about this secret. She's a liability. Why is she a liability? Because she's not in control of her emotions. She acts impulsively, so she's unpredictable. And Tosca repeatedly, there's like 20 examples where she puts her needs before Mario's. And in turn, Mario doesn't ground her in reality or like confront her. Rather, he appeases her, keeps her happy, keeps her from reacting, having big emotions. And so when reality intrudes on the relationship, it can't survive. It collapses. So their love doesn't fail because it's false. There is love there for sure, but it's a superficial love, and it fails because it refuses to evolve and mature. Well, the Tosca we think we know is not Puccini's Tosca. La Tosca, the play, was written for the great Sarah Bernhardt. And she plays the role in a much more volatile, childish, sexual, impulsive, dangerous manner than what we think of today. In fact, Puccini and his librettists were so obsessed with Bernhardt that while she was on tour, they went to many of her performances to basically study and take in her interpretation of this, her creation of this character. And in fact, they took some of her staging and wrote it in the score. So after she murders Scarpia, this very calm, she fixes her hair, very ritualized reaction to having just murdered a man, it comes directly from Sarah Bernhardt. And the vocalist that I am most inspired by is Bianca Scacciati. She really also has these volatile, childish, aggressive, dangerous sounds in her extremely dramatic, bright, brilliant voice. And so when Maria Callas came on the scene, and she shifted the gravity around this role, and her Tosca became saintly and innocent and primarily a victim. And so this reading rather was grounded in sympathy. And characters who get the audience's sympathy, they get more applause. So I think at that point, the whole performance tradition shifted, and we forgot about the origin of this role. So Tosca, at that point in time, lost her danger and her agency. And this also then had an effect on the tragic symmetry. Because without tragic symmetry, Tosca stops being a tragedy and it starts being moral theater, which it's not. It's a psychological thriller. I think the most revealing thing about Tosca is not what the characters do. I think it's how we react to the situation and who we're willing to forgive and what we're willing to forgive and what we're not willing to forgive. I think that tells us a lot about ourselves. It's not about villains and victims. It really is the belief of getting out of accountability, about bypassing responsibility. Tosca chose destruction of Mario, Scarpia, and ultimately herself, instead of stepping into accountability. So the tragedy is not in that she suffers, that Mario suffers. It's really that she refused to live with the outcome. So Tosca doesn't show us injustice. It shows us what happens when we believe we are exempt from consequences. We excuse behaviors we recognize in ourselves and condemn the ones that make us uncomfortable. So what we're able to forgive reveals where we identify.